All right. Tonight we are going to read. Uh, what is it? It's part two. So the second part of 1984, chapter one. So we've already read all of part one, and now we're going to do part two, chapter one. This will not be a typical reading because we're going to go very slowly and we are going to talk about interesting words that we find. Or if there are some complicated phrases, we will take them apart and try to understand what they mean. Mostly, this is for people learning English, but also this could be for people who already know English but want to analyze or look at 1984 very carefully. So let's get started. Now in the last chapter, Winston had gone into a part of town where he shouldn't go. And he went to the old shop where he bought his journal, which is very dangerous to go there for a member of the party to go to a place like that. And he spent some time in the shop, and he got into his head that he would like to rent a room in the shop because the shop owner had an apartment above the store where he and his wife used to live, but then his wife passed away. And Winston got this idea that he could rent that room from the owner of the shop. A very dangerous idea, a very risky thing. And when he was walking home, he saw a member of the party in that same part of town. And she is a very scary woman to him. He's very afraid of this woman. She's a fanatic of the party. And he even thought about murdering her because she saw him. And he was afraid that she would tell the police that he was in that neighborhood. So he's very paranoid, very scared, and he's thinking about doing some dangerous things. So now let's see what happens in part two of 1984. That's where we stopped. It was the middle of the morning, and Winston had left the cubicle to go to the lavatory. In case you don't know, that's the bathroom. A solitary figure was coming towards him from the other end of the long, brightly lit corridor. Oh, by the way, if you're watching this live with me and you have a question about a word or a phrase that you don't understand, I encourage you to ask questions. I'm happy to stop and talk about any words or phrases that confuse you. That's the whole point of reading this. So I really want you to ask questions as we go. A solitary figure was coming towards him from the other end of the long, brightly lit corridor. It was the girl with the dark hair. So that's the girl who saw him in this part of town where he's not supposed to go. The girl that he wants to murder before she tells on him. 4 days had gone past since the evening when he had run into her outside the junk shop. As she came nearer, he saw that her right arm was in a sling. Let me show you what a sling is. So I'm just looking for a picture of arm in a sling just to show you what that means. This is an arm in a sling. This is a sling in that context. As she came nearer, he saw that her right arm was in a sling, not noticeable at a distance because it was of the same color as her overalls. Probably she had crushed her hand while swinging round one of the big kaleidoscopes on which the plots of novels were roughed in. It was a common accident in the fiction department. They were perhaps 4 meters apart, when the girl stumbled and fell almost on her face. Now, stumble is an interesting word. Let me see if I can find something to show you what stumble means. Let's see. Okay, well, here's maybe a good picture of stumble. So you see this woman, the way she's walking. Even at the end, I wish they would show the end, because stumble almost means like when you fall. So she's stumbling, and to complete the action would be actually to fall on the floor. That would really be stumble. Maybe we can find another example where we actually see somebody fall. Here's a penguin. Does he stumble? Yeah, okay, this is good. The penguin. Here's a penguin stumbling. That's stumbling. So you actually fall. Actually, I think that's a good word. I'm going to write that word here, stumble. That's stumble. Okay, so I'm just keeping track of interesting words so I can make little videos or exercises about these words later. So make sure you find those if you want to practice your vocabulary. All right, they're on my channel, which means subscribe. Okay, so now that we know what stumble means, let's go back. They were perhaps 4 meters apart when the girl stumbled and almost fell flat on her face. That means her face almost went like this onto the ground. A sharp cry of pain was wrung out of her. She must have fallen. Sorry, I lost my place. She must have fallen right on the injured arm. So she stumbled and fell, and she actually landed on this arm that was in the sling. So she was screaming in pain. Winston stopped short. The girl had risen to her knees. Her face had turned a milky yellow color, against which her mouth stood out redder than ever. Her eyes were fixed on his, with an appealing expression. So appealing means like asking for something. So she was looking at him like asking for help or asking for something, who knows what. With an appealing expression that looked more like fear than pain. A curious Nitin Kumar says hi. Hi, Nitin Kumar. How are you doing tonight? Thank you for joining us. A curious emotion stirred in Winston's heart. Stir means like move. So a strange emotion was moving around in his heart. He felt strange in his heart. In front of him was an enemy who was trying to kill him. In front of him also was a human creature in pain and perhaps with a broken bone. Already, he had instinctively started forward to help her. So remember, he's afraid of this woman. She saw him in a very bad situation. He was even thinking about murdering her before she could tell the police what he was doing. But now she fell and she was in pain. So he had this strange conflict of being afraid and hating her, but also feeling bad because she was in pain and wanting to help her. In the moment when he had seen her fall on the bandaged arm, it had been as though he felt the pain in his own body. So he was feeling her pain. "You're hurt," he said. "It's nothing, my arm. It'll be all right in a second." She spoke as though her heart were fluttering. Fluttering is like the movement of a butterfly's wings, fluttering. So her heart was fluttering. She had certainly turned very pale, very white. "You haven't broken anything?" "No, I'm all right. It hurt for a moment, that's all." She held out her free hand to him, and he helped her up. She regained some of her color and appeared very much better. It's nothing, she repeated shortly. I only gave my wrist a bit of a bang. Thanks, comrade. And with that she walked on in the direction in which she had been going, as briskly, very quickly, as though it had really been nothing. The whole incident could not have taken as much as half a minute. Not to let one's feelings appear in one's face was a habit that had acquired the status of an instinct. So he's saying you never showed people what you were feeling. That was like an instinct, a natural reaction was to cover your real feelings. So she would never admit to another person that she was in pain or having a difficult time. And in any case, they had been standing straight in front of a telescreen when the thing happened. So definitely she would not say anything negative or bad because they were right in front of the telescreen, which monitors everything that you say and do. So even if she wanted to be normal, to be natural, she never would do that, not in front of the telescreen. Nevertheless, it had been very difficult not to betray a momentary surprise, for in the 2 or 3 seconds while he was helping her up, the girl had slipped something into his hand. So when you slip something into someone's hand, that would be like imagine this is a message. And if somebody goes like this, hiding the thing and then leaving it in your hand, that's slipping something in your hand. So secretly, she gave him something. Interesting. She slipped something into his hand. So when he was helping her up, she grabbed his hand and she put a message also in his hand. There was no question that she had done it intentionally. It was something small and flat. It was something small and flat. As he passed through the lavatory door, he transferred it to his pocket and felt it with the tips of his fingers. It was a scrap of paper. And actually, this is a scrap of paper, like a little piece of paper like this is a scrap of paper. Why do I have that in my drawer? That should be in the garbage. Scrap of paper. It was a scrap of paper folded into a square. While he stood at the urinal, he managed, with a little more fingering, to get it unfolded. So he's got his hand in his pocket and he's manipulating the paper to unfold it while it's in his pocket. Obviously, there must be a message of some kind written on it. For a moment, he was tempted to take it into one of the water closets and read it at once. But that would be shocking folly. That would be extremely stupid. That would be a very stupid thing to do, as he well knew. There was no place where you could be more certain that the telescreens were watched continuously. So, you think that a bathroom stall, the place where the toilet is with the door, that would be a very private place. But definitely they were watching you in there because, of course, you think this is the place for privacy. So obviously they have cameras there because that's where you would do something private. He went back to his cubicle, sat down, threw the fragment of paper casually among the other papers on the desk. So if you throw something casually, it's like you don't care. So he had the paper and he just threw it like it was nothing special, like that. Put on his spectacles, his glasses, and hitched the speakwrite towards him. 5 minutes, he told himself, 5 minutes at the very least. So he really wants to read the message, but he's saying, no, I can't do it now. I have to wait at least 5 minutes before I do it. His heart bumped in his breast. This is the breast. His heart bumped in his breast with frightening loudness. Fortunately, the piece of work he was engaged on was mere routine, the rectification of a long list of figures. Rectification means like fixing or changing to make it right. So the rectification of a long list of figures, a long list of numbers. So he was changing numbers, not needing close attention. Whatever was written on the paper, it must have been some kind of political meaning. So far as he could see, there were two possibilities. One, much the more likely was that the girl was an agent of the thought police, just as he had feared. He did not know why the thought police should choose to deliver their messages in such a fashion, but perhaps they had their reasons. The thing that was written on the paper might be a threat, a summons. Summon means like, come here. So a summons, that's like an official piece of paper, usually from a judge or for the government, which says, you have to report to me, you have to come to me and talk to me. That's what a summons is. Summon means come to me. And so a summons, that's when the government, like a judge maybe, orders you, writes an official piece of paper saying, come here, come to see me, come to talk to me, officially. So the paper might be a threat, it might be a summons, in order to commit suicide, a trap of some description. But there was another, wilder possibility that kept raising its head, though he tried vainly to suppress it. That's actually a pretty interesting phrase. I'm going to put that up here. To try in vain. Let me write that. This is just a reminder for me later to make a little exercise about this phrase, because it's a useful phrase. To try in vain. That means you attempt to do something. You attempt to do something, but it's impossible to do. So when you try something in vain, it means you try to do it, but you could never accomplish it. What was he trying in vain? Let's see. He tried in vain to suppress. So there was another idea, and he tried to suppress it. He tried not to think about it. But that was in vain. It was impossible not to think about this. This was that the message did not come from the thought police at all, but from some kind of underground organization. Perhaps the Brotherhood existed after all. Perhaps the girl was part of it. No doubt, the idea was absurd. That means crazy, stupid. But it had sprung into his mind in the very instant of feeling the scrap of paper in his hand. It was not till a couple of minutes later that the other, more probable explanation had occurred to him. And even now, though his intellect told him that the message probably meant death, still, that was not what he believed, and the unreasonable hope persisted, and his heart banged, bang, 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 and it was with difficulty that he kept his voice from trembling as he murmured his figures into the speak-right. Murmured his figures, but he was trembling when he was doing it because he was very nervous. That's trembling. His voice was trembling. He was very upset, very scared. He rolled up the completed bundle of work and slid it to the pneumatic tube. 8 minutes had gone by. 8 minutes had passed. He readjusted his spectacles on his nose, sighed, and drew the next batch of work towards him. He drew it towards him. He drew the next batch of work towards him. With the scrap of paper on top of it, he flattened it out. On it was written a large, unformed handwriting, "I love you." For several seconds, he was too stunned, too surprised, too shocked to even throw the incriminating thing into the memory hole. When he did so, although he knew very well the danger of showing too much interest, he could not resist reading it once again, just to make sure that the words were really there. For the rest of the morning, it was very difficult to work. What was even worse than having to focus his mind on a series of niggling jobs was the need to conceal his agitation from the telescreen. To be agitated means to be like nervous or frustrated, so he was in a very strange mood after this. It was difficult to act normal. He felt as though a fire were burning in his belly. Belly is the stomach area. That's kind of a funny word for the stomach area. So there was a burning in his stomach, but it's funnier or more interesting to say belly. Lunch in the hot, crowded, noise-filled canteen was torment. He had hoped to be alone for a little while during the lunch hour, but as bad luck would have it, the imbecile Parsons flopped down beside him, the tang of his sweat almost defeating the tinny smell of the stew. So Parsons, that's his big fat neighbor, his big fat annoying neighbor. So they live in the same apartment building, and he's really fat and sweaty and smelly. And the smell in the cafeteria, the stew, which is like a soup, smells really horrible. But Winston found that Parsons smells so bad that the two odors, the two smells were fighting each other. The horrible smell of the food in the cafeteria, the stew, the soup, and the smell of Parsons, of big fat Parsons. And kept up a stream of talk about the preparations for Hate Week. He was particularly enthusiastic about the papier-mâché model of Big Brother's head, 2 meters wide, which was being made for the occasion by his daughter's troop of spies. The irritating thing was that in the racket of voices, Winston could hardly hear what Parsons was saying, and was constantly having to ask for some fatuous remark to be repeated. What does that word fatuous mean? That's kind of a fancy word. Let's see. Fatuous. That's not a very common word, so we won't put that on the list. Fatuous. Silly, pointless. So if you want to sound very fancy, you can say fatuous when you want to mean silly or pointless. Just once he caught a glimpse of the girl at a table with 2 other girls at the far end of the room. She appeared not to have seen him, and he did not look in that direction again. That afternoon was more bearable. Immediately, bearable means easy to do, not so difficult. So that morning was very difficult for Winston. He started off nervous because that girl had seen him, and then she passed him that note. She slipped it into his hand, and that was crazy. And since then, he's been very nervous and anxious. And then he had lunch, and then in the afternoon, it was more bearable. It was easier to do, not so difficult. The afternoon was more bearable. Immediately after lunch, there arrived a delicate, difficult piece of work, which would take several hours and necessitated putting everything else aside. It consisted in falsifying a series of production reports of 2 years ago, in such a ways as to cast discredit on a prominent member of the inner party, who was now under a cloud. This was the kind of thing that Winston was good at, And for more than 2 hours, he succeeded in shutting the girl out. Let's see. Let's put that up there. That's a phrasal verb, to shut something or someone out. I'm going to add that to my list. We'll say shut something out. Shut something out. And in a way, I would say that maybe that means something like ignore. Ignore something. Oh wow, this is really hard to see. Oh well, there's no space where it's easy to see. Hopefully you can see that. Shut something out. So that kind of means like to try to ignore something. Let's see, what is he ignoring? He succeeded in shutting the girl out of his mind altogether. So he was working so hard, it was easy for him to ignore or avoid thinking about the girl. Then the memory of her face came back, and with it a raging, intolerable desire to be alone. Until he could be alone, it was impossible to think this new development out. So he wanted to be alone, to meditate about this, to think about what just happened today. This is crazy. So he wanted to think it out. He wanted to review everything and decide, what is this? What happened? Tonight was one of his nights at the community center. He wolfed another tasteless meal in the canteen. Oh, let's put that. That's kind of a funny, interesting phrasal verb. Well, they're not actually using the phrasal verb here, but I'm going to put wolf down. I'm going to use the phrasal verb, wolf down. They just say wolf here, but I'm going to use wolf down. Wolfing something down is eating something very quickly, just like an animal, just shoving it in your face and finishing with it. So, and the stew, the food in the cafeteria tastes horrible, so you wouldn't want that in your mouth very long. You just put it in your mouth and try to swallow it very quickly. He wolfed another tasteless meal in the canteen, hurried off to the center, took part in the solemn foolery. Take part means participate. So he participated in the solemn foolery. Solemn means very serious, but foolery means something stupid. So they were doing something stupid, but you had to take it very seriously. In the solemn foolery of the discussion group. So there was a group having a conversation about some topic that was really stupid, but you had to take it very seriously. You had to be very serious about it, even if it was stupid. Played 2 games of table tennis, swallowed several glasses of gin, and sat for half an hour through a lecture entitled Ingsoc in relation to chess. So that's like the party's philosophy regarding the game of chess. His soul writhed with boredom. Writhing is this movement, the movement of a snake. His soul writhed with boredom. But for once he had no impulse to shirk his evening at the center. Let's put the word shirk up here. Shirk is like ignore. To shirk. It's usually used for things that you're responsible for. So if you shirk your responsibilities, that means you have responsibilities, you know what they are, but you say, you don't do them. You ignore them. You push them away. So if you shirk someone, that's like saying, go away. I don't want. It's like ignoring someone. So when it says he didn't want to shirk his evening at the center, he doesn't like going to the community center for obvious reasons. He doesn't like talking to those people or participating in these groups. So sometimes he ignores it, which is a very dangerous thing. He shirks it. He's supposed to go there, but he doesn't. That's why they're using shirk here. But tonight, he had no desire to shirk his evening at the center. He wanted to go to the center tonight. At the sight of the words, "I love you," the desire to stay alive had welled up in him. So suddenly, he wanted to live again. And the taking of minor risks suddenly seemed stupid. So he was doing some very risky behavior earlier. Many things that he knew could get him killed. Sooner or later, he was sure that they would kill him. But suddenly, now that this girl says, "I love you," he doesn't want to take those risks anymore. Now he wants to go to the community center because he doesn't want to make them suspicious. Suddenly he cares about living. It was not till 23 hours when he was home and in bed, in the darkness, where you were safe even from the telescreen so long as you kept silent, that he was able to think continuously. It was a physical problem that had to be solved. How to get in touch with the girl and arrange a meeting. He did not consider any longer the possibility that she might be laying some kind of trap for him. So at first he thought that she was some kind of spy trying to trick him. But he finally didn't think about that anymore. I guess he was kind of hoping that it was real. He knew that it was not so because of her unmistakable agitation when she handed him the note. So he was convinced that the way that she gave him the note was evidence that she was sincere, that it wasn't a trap. As well she might be. Oh wait. Obviously, she had been frightened out of her wits. As well she might be. Nor did the idea of refusing her advances even cross his mind. I think that's a good phrase. Cross my mind. Let's put that up here. Cross my mind. Oh, that's a very common expression. To cross my mind. To cross your mind means to think about, to have the idea pop into your head, to have the idea come into your head. Let's see, how did they use it here? Nor did the idea of refusing her advances even cross his mind. So the idea never came into his head to say no to her. That never was an option. It never appeared in his head to say no. So he wants to be with her. Only 5 nights ago, he had contemplated smashing her skull. Remember, she saw him, he hated her before, and she saw him in a neighborhood where he should never go. And he was afraid that she was going to report him to the police, and then he would definitely be killed. So he was thinking about following her and killing her before she could report him to the police. This was just 5 days ago that he wanted to kill her. But that was of no importance. He thought of her naked, youthful body as he had seen it in his dream. He had imagined her a fool like the rest of them, her head stuffed with lies and hatred, her belly full of ice. Remember, belly is a kind of a funny word for stomach. Her stomach full of ice, her belly full of ice. A kind of fever seized him at the thought that he might lose her. The white, youthful body might slip away from him, escape from him, go away from him. What he feared more than anything else was that she simply would change her mind if he did not get in touch with her quickly. But the physical difficulty of meeting was enormous. It was like trying to make a move at chess when you already made it. Whichever way you turned, the telescreen faced you. Actually, all of the possible ways of communicating with her had occurred to him within 5 minutes of reading the note. But now, with time to think, he went over them, one by one, as though laying out a row of instruments on a table. Obviously, the kind of encounter that had happened this morning could not be repeated. If she had worked in the records department, it might have been comparatively simple. But he had only a very dim idea of the whereabouts in the building the fiction department lay. Now, dim, let me see what kind of picture we can get for the word dim. I know I've talked about that word several times before, but it doesn't hurt to review what dim means. Dim means not very much light. So let's take a look at this picture here. Dim. Okay. So look at these two light bulbs. The light bulb, let's see. The light bulb on the left is very bright, and the light bulb on the right is dim. It means not very much light. So if you have a dim idea, that means you have a little idea. It's not a very clear idea. It's just a small idea. There isn't much light. So he only had a dim idea of where her department was. He knew approximately where it was located. That's what it means. He only had a very dim... You know what? I like this word whereabouts. I think that's actually a pretty interesting word. That would be something that would be good to make a little video about whereabouts. Which means where something is. That's all it means. But I think that's not a very... Like, a lot of people don't know that word, or it's not a word practiced very much for people learning English. Whereabouts. So I think it would be good to make a video about that word, whereabouts. Okay, that just means where something is. So he only had a dim idea of the whereabouts, where it was, the office where she worked. And he had no pretext for going there. He had no reason to go there. If he had known where she lived and at what time she left work, he could have invented to meet her somewhere on her way home. But to try to follow her home was not safe because it would mean loitering. Loitering means standing in one place for no reason. So actually, you will see, let me just show you a picture. Let's see if I can find a real life picture. Okay, you might see a sign like this in front of a store. This is a pretty common thing to see. So you see this is a store, and on the window it says no loitering. That means you're not allowed to just stand outside in front of the store doing nothing. They don't like that. And that's what loitering is. Loitering is just standing somewhere doing nothing. And a lot of stores don't like it if you do that in front of their store because it makes the customers feel uncomfortable. So Winston couldn't follow her home because at some point he would have to loiter. He would have to stand outside somewhere and just wait. And that would be very suspicious. That would get the attention of the police. Loitering about outside the ministry, especially in front of the ministry, which was bound to be noticed. As for sending a letter through the mail, it was out of the question. By a routine that was not even secret, all letters were opened in transit. Actually, few people ever wrote letters. For the messages that it was occasionally necessary to send, there were printed postcards with long lists of phrases, and you struck out the ones that were inapplicable. So most people, instead of writing a personal letter, would buy a card with phrases, and you would just cross out the phrases you didn't want, and the phrases that remained would be your message. That's crazy. And you struck out the ones that were inapplicable. In any case, he did not know the girl's name, let alone her address, and finally he decided that the safest place was the canteen. If he could get her at a table by herself, somewhere in the middle of the room, not near the telescreens, and with a sufficient buzz of conversation all around, if these conditions endured for, say, 30 seconds, it might be possible to exchange a few words. For a week after this, life was like a restless dream. Restless means can't stop moving. The word restless is usually associated with being nervous. So, if you're nervous, you're always moving. If you're restless, you have a lot of energy. So a restless dream, a dream where you're moving. On the next day, she did not appear in the canteen until he was leaving it, the whistle having already blown. So a whistle is like, like back to work. That's a whistle. So the whistle already blown means it's time to go back to work. Presumably, she had been changed onto a later shift. They passed each other without a glance. On the day after that, she was in the canteen at the usual time, but with 3 other girls, and immediately under the telescreen. Then for 3 dreadful, that means horrible, for 3 dreadful days, she did not appear at all. His whole mind and body seemed to be afflicted with an unbearable sensitivity. So unbearable means can't stand it, can't tolerate it. It's really hard. It's really difficult. So he was afflicted with unbearable sensitivity. He was so sensitive that it was difficult for him to do things. A sort of transparency which made every movement, every sound, every contact, every word that he had to speak or listen to an agony. Agony means a painful situation. So every movement, every sound, every contact was painful. Even in sleep, he could not altogether escape from her image. He did not touch the diary during those days. If there was any relief, it was in his work, in which he could sometimes forget himself for 10 minutes at a stretch. At a stretch means like complete 10 minutes. So never stopping for 10 minutes. So a stretch of 10 minutes is just 100% 10 minutes, never stopping during that period. He had absolutely no clue as to what happened to her. There was no enquiry he could make. She might have been vaporized. She might have committed suicide. She might have been transferred to another end of Oceania. Worst and likeliest of all, she might simply have changed her mind and decided to avoid him. The next day, she reappeared. Her arm was out of the sling, and she had a band of sticking plaster round her wrist. The relief of seeing her was so great that he could not resist staring directly at her for several seconds. On the following day, he very nearly succeeded in speaking to her. When he came into the canteen, she was sitting at the table, well out from the wall, and was quite alone. It was early, and the place was not very full. The queue edged forward. So a queue is a line. So the queue edged forward means like they moved, like this, going forward, getting their food very slowly. It was early, and the place was not very full. The queue edged forward till Winston was almost at the counter, then was held up for 2 minutes because someone in front was complaining that he had not received his tablet of saccharin. Oh, that sounds like a big mistake. But the girl was still alone when Winston secured his tray and began to make for her table. Oh, that's a kind of interesting one. Let's put that up here. To make for a place. I think that was actually in chapter 1. Oh, I forget what number I'm on. I'll just put 8. To make for a place. That's similar to go to a place, but the difference is when you make for a place, you definitely you really very badly want to get to that other destination. So if you say John went to the store, that's pretty normal. Everybody can understand that. But if you say John made for the store, it means the same thing, but it has this extra idea of he's desperate to get to the store. That destination is very important for some reason. So when it says Winston made for her table, it sounds like he was desperate to get to the table. And we know why, because he wants to talk to the girl. He walked casually towards her. Do you remember a few pages ago, he threw the paper casually onto the table, like he didn't onto his desk. He didn't care. He really cared about that piece of paper. He wanted to read it, but he had to pretend like it wasn't important. So he casually, just threw it onto the table. So when you do something casually, you're doing it in a way that makes it seem unimportant, like you don't care. And here, what does it say? He casually walked towards her. So he walked towards her, trying to make it seem like he didn't care. He did care very much, but he was trying very hard to look like he didn't care. That's why they're saying casually here. He walked casually towards her, his eyes searching for a place at some table beyond her. So he was pretending to look for a table after hers. She was perhaps 3 meters away from him. Another 2 seconds would do it. Then a voice behind him called, "Smith!" He pretended not to hear. "Smith!" repeated the voice more loudly. It was no use. He turned round. A blonde-headed, silly-faced young man named Wilshire, whom he barely knew, was inviting him with a smile to a vacant place at his table. So one of his co-workers was inviting him to come sit at the table. He could not go sit at a table with an unattended girl. It was too noticeable. He sat down with a friendly smile. The silly blonde face beamed into his. So the silly blonde face beamed. He was very happy, very bright into his. Winston had a hallucination of himself smashing a pickaxe right into the middle of it. So Winston wanted to kill him. The girls' table filled up a few minutes later. But she must have seen him coming towards her, and perhaps she would take the hint. Next day, he took care not to arrive early. Or let me read that again. Next day, he took care, he was very careful, to arrive early. Surely enough, she was at a table in about the same place and again alone. The person immediately ahead of him in the queue was a small, swiftly moving, beetle-like man with a flat face and tiny, suspicious eyes. As Winston turned away from the counter with his tray, he saw that the little man was making straight for the girl's table. So again, they're using making for, meaning going to. And when they say the man was making for her table, remember the difference between go to the table and make for the table is when you make for a place, you have a goal. And that goal was probably, he said, "Oh, empty seat. I better hurry and sit there before someone else." And that's what you can understand from the man made for the table. That means he had some kind of goal. And in this context, we know, oh, I better sit there before someone else sits there. His hopes sank again. There was a vacant place at a table further away, but something in the little man's appearance suggested that he would be sufficiently attentive to his own comfort to choose the emptiest table. With ice at his heart, Winston followed. It was no use unless he could get the girl alone. At this moment, there was a tremendous crash. The little man was sprawling on all fours. So sprawling means like covering a large area in a very disorganized way. Let me see if we can find some pictures of the word sprawl. Okay, let's see. Okay, now this is suburban sprawl. That means the houses are covering every area. But let's find a person sprawling. Let's see if we can find a person. Here's a person sprawling. Okay, so if somebody is sprawling, it means maybe that they're on the floor or they're laying somewhere, but also their arms and their legs are everywhere, covering the most space. Now let's see, let's reread that part again. Okay. There was a tremendous crash. The little man was sprawling on all fours. So on all fours, his two arms and his two legs. So he fell and he was on the floor. His tray had gone flying, and two streams of soup and coffee were flowing across the floor. He started to his feet with a malignant glance at Winston. So malignant means evil. I think maybe accidentally Winston, or maybe not so accidentally, Winston pushed him. Because if the man is glaring malignantly at him, it means like this. He's angry. Malignant means evil, bad. So, and glance means look, a malignant glance. Whom he evidently suspected of having tripped him up. But it was all right. 5 seconds later, with a thundering heart, Winston was sitting at the girl's table. So did Winston push him? I don't know. He did not look at her. He unpacked his tray and promptly began eating. It was all important to speak at once before anyone else came. But now, a terrible fear had taken possession of him. A week had gone by. A week had passed since she had first approached him. She would have changed her mind. She must have changed her mind. It was impossible that this affair should end successfully. Such things did not happen in real life. He might have flinched. Flinching is like that. Altogether, for speaking, if at this moment he had not seen ample forth. A hairy-eared poet, wandering limply round the room with a tray, looking for a place to sit down. In his vague way, Ampleforth was attached to Winston, and would certainly sit down at his table if he caught sight of him. If he was perhaps there was perhaps a minute in which to act. So one of his co-workers, who was very friendly with Winston, was looking for a table, and Winston knew that if this man saw him, he would definitely go to that table and sit down. So he was very afraid to talk to the girl but he knew there was only about 1 minute to do it. Both Winston and the girl were eating steadily. The stuff they were eating was a thin stew, actually a soup, of haricot beans. In a low murmur, that's a murmur, Winston began speaking. Neither of them looked up. Steadily, they spooned the watery stuff into their mouths, and between spoonfuls, exchanged a few necessary words in low, expressionless voices. "What time do you leave work?" 8:30. "Where can we meet?" "Victory Square, near the monument." "It's full of telescreens. It doesn't matter if there's a crowd." "Any signal?" "No, don't come up to me till you see me among a lot of people. And don't look at me. Just keep somewhere near me." "What time?" 19 hours. "All right." Ampleforth failed to see Winston and sat down at another table. They did not speak again. And so far as it was possible for two people sitting on opposite sides of the same table, they did not look at one another. The girl finished her lunch quickly and made off, while Winston stayed to smoke a cigarette. Winston was in Victory Square before the appointed time. He wandered round the base of the enormous fluted column, at the top of which Big Brother's statue looked southward, gazed southward towards the skies where he had vanquished the Eurasian aeroplanes, the East Asian aeroplanes. It had been, a few years ago, the Battle of Airstrip 1. In the street in front of it, there was a statue of a man on horseback, which was supposed to represent Oliver Cromwell. At 5 minutes past the hour, the girl had still not appeared. Again, a terrible fear seized upon Winston. She was not coming. She had changed her mind. He walked slowly up to the north side of the square and got a sort of pale-colored pleasure from identifying St. Martin's Church, whose bells, when it had bells, chimed, "You owe me 3 farthings." Then he saw the girl standing at the base of the monument, reading, or pretending to read, a poster, which ran spirally. Spiral is like this, spiral shape, up the column. It was not safe to go near her till some more people had accumulated. There were telescreens all round the pediment. But at this moment there was a din of shouting and a zoom of heavy vehicles from somewhere to the left. Suddenly, everyone seemed to be running across the square. The girl nipped nimbly round the lions at the base of the monument and joined in the rush. Winston followed. As he ran, he gathered from some shouted remarks that a convoy of Eurasian prisoners was passing. So he sees the girl, but he can't go near her because she's all alone. He has to wait for more people. But just at this moment, there was a parade of prisoners being marched down the street. So the police were taking some soldiers that they captured to who knows where. And this created a lot of excitement, and all the people in the square went to go see the prisoners walking down the street. And so this, I guess, was an opportunity for Winston to go see the girl, because maybe the girl will follow all the people, and Winston can also go and try to talk to her. Already a dense mass of people was blocking the south side of the square. Winston, at normal times, the kind of person who gravitates to the outer edge of a kind of scrimmage, shoved, butted, squirmed his way forward into the heart of the crowd. So Winston usually hates being in the middle of a large group of people. But in this case, he wanted to be in the middle so that the telescreens couldn't see him. So he pushed people and shoved people so that he could be in the middle of the crowd, of the group of people. Soon he was within arm's length of the girl, but the way was blocked by an enormous prole and an almost equally enormous woman, presumably his wife, who seemed to form an impenetrable wall of flesh. Flesh means meat, and impenetrable means you can't go inside of it. So the two big fat husband and wife proles standing very close to each other, it was impossible to penetrate. It was impossible to move through them. But he was so close to the girl. With a violent lunge, managed to drive his shoulder between them. So he pushed really hard to get between them. For a moment, it felt as though his entrails were being ground to a pulp between the two muscular hips. Then he had broken through. Sweating a little, he was next to the girl. They were shoulder to shoulder, so they were touching shoulders, both staring fixedly in front of them. So they were both looking like this, but they were touching shoulders. They were shoulder to shoulder. A long line of trucks with wooden-faced guards armed with submachine guns standing upright in each corner was passing slowly down the street. In the trucks, little yellow men in shabby greenish uniforms were squatting, jammed close together. Their sad Mongolian faces gazed out over the sides of the trucks, utterly incurious. Occasionally, when a truck jolted, there was a clank-clank of metal. All the prisoners were wearing leg irons. Truckload after truckload of the sad faces passed. Winston knew that they were, Winston knew they were there, but he saw them only intermittently. So the prisoners were going down the street, and Winston knew that they were there, but he only saw them sometimes. I guess maybe because he was thinking about the girl next to him. The girl's shoulder and her right arm down to the elbow were pressed against his. So they were touching all the way through this part here. Her cheek was almost near enough for him to feel its warmth. She had immediately taken charge of the situation, just as she had done in the canteen. She began speaking in the same expressionless voice as before, with lips barely moving, mere murmur, easily drowned by the din of voices and the rumbling of trucks. Can you hear me? Yes. Can you get Sunday afternoon off? That means, is it possible that you don't work on Sunday? Yes. Then listen carefully. You have to remember this. Go to Paddington Station. With a sort of military precision that astonished him, she outlined the route that he was to follow. A half-hour railway journey, turn left outside the station, 2 kilometers along the road, a gate, the top bar missing, a path across a field, a grass-grown lane, the track between bushes, a dead tree with moss on it. It was as though she had a map inside her head. Can you remember all that? She murmured, finally, yes. You turn left, then right, then left again. And the gate's got no top bar. Yes, what time? About 15. You may have to wait. I'll get there by another way. Are you sure you remember everything? Then get away from me as quick as you can. She need not have told him that, but for the moment, they could not extricate themselves from the crowd. They couldn't go away from the crowd. They were stuck in the crowd. The trucks were still filing past, the people still insatiably gaping. At the start, there had been a few boos, boo, and hisses, "Sss." But it came only from the party members among the crowd, and had soon stopped. The prevailing emotion was simply curiosity. Foreigners, whether from Eurasia or from East Asia, were a kind of strange animal. One literally never saw them except in the guise of prisoners, and even as prisoners one never got more than a momentary glimpse of them. Nor did one know what became of them, apart from the few who were hanged as war criminals. The others simply vanished, presumably into forced labor camps. The round Mogul, I think that's a misprint. Mongol faces, maybe it's Mogul, I don't know. Faces had given way to faces of more European type, dirty, bearded, and exhausted. From over scrubby cheekbones, eyes looked into Winston's, sometimes with a strange intensity, and flashed away again. The convoy was drawing to an end. In the last truck, he could see an aged man, his face a mass of grizzled hair, standing upright with wrists crossed in front of him as though he were used to having them bound together. It was almost time for Winston and the girl to part. But at the last moment, while the crowd still hemmed them in, her hand felt his and gave it a fleeting squeeze. So for a moment, just a moment, she grabbed his hand and she squeezed it. It could not have been 10 seconds, and yet it seemed a long time that their hands were clasped together. He had time to learn every detail of her hand. He explored the long fingers, the shapely nails, the worked, hardened palm with its row of calluses, the smooth flesh under the wrist. Merely from feeling it, he would have known it by sight. In the same instant, it occurred to him that he did not know what color the girl's eyes were. They were probably brown, but people with dark hair sometimes had blue eyes. To turn his head and look at her would have been inconceivable folly. So it would have been really stupid to try to look at her again. With hands locked together, invisible among the press of bodies, they stared steadily in front of them. Instead of the eyes of the girl, the eyes of the aged prisoner gazed mournfully at Winston out of nests of hair. All right, we have finished chapter 1 of part 2 of 1984. So next time we will start reading chapter 2 of part 2 of 1984. Thank you everyone who stayed and watched for the entire reading of that. And I will see you again next time with another reading of 1984 by George Orwell.